Once you get past the basic turn-based combat on a grid, mechanical features in Fire Emblem are like getting a fresh hand dealt with each new game. Nothing really sticks around forever, whether that's rescuing, or dismounting, or durability, or even the signature weapon triangle, which is indeed absent in a handful of games and has been tweaked in all sorts of ways in the rest. Intelligent Systems is constantly experimenting with the mechanics of this franchise, and while sometimes that can feel more like the generational gimmicks of Pokémon, where it's a feature that takes center stage once and then drops off the face of the earth, most of the time these mechanics come and go in unpredictable cycles. And that's certainly true for Fire Emblem's magic systems, because let me tell you, being a fan of mages in this series can be a rough time. Depending on which game you're talking about, staves and other forms of utility magic can be incredibly powerful, but all too often, offensive magic is conceptualized merely as a minor variation on physical weapons, making use of different stats and coming with flashier effects, but ultimately being not that different from your ordinary hand axe or javelin, if we're taking into account range versatility. Magic in Fire Emblem has a bumpy history of being essentially a cast-off physical weapon type, as seen in the numerous games where tomes are buyable and breakable items treated just like any other weapon. To be fair, the franchise has made various attempts to differentiate magic from its physical counterparts. All the way back in 1990, the original Shadow Dragon envisioned magic as a sort of defense-piercing, flat damage option that wasn't affected by attack power or accuracy, and that didn't have to worry about resistance because that stat effectively didn't exist. Since then, however, magic has only become more standardized, more subject to all the same rules and numbers as physical weapons, and less distinctive in the process. This philosophy arguably reaches its low point with Fates, which removes durability for everything but staves, but also implements a complicated system of restrictions and debuffs on all its weapons that apply in exactly the same way to its offensive magic options. Props to the game for the added flavor of Hoshiden's scrolls and their nods to the Eastern Zodiac, but that's not enough to keep magic in Fates from feeling like just another weapon, especially since Shuriken exists as an equally reliable source of 1 to 2 range damage, with both extra effects and a prominent novelty factor. Oh, and they also have a triangle advantage over tomes, just to twist the knife. Shuriken. That expression doesn't really work here. That leaves us, as you might expect, with the subject of this video. Spell lists make an appearance in 3 mainline Fire Emblem games, although no one cares about Gaiden, and almost no one cares about Echoes, so realistically we're focusing on 3 houses here. That is not, by the way, to discount the importance of the Valentia games in this conversation, as they were the ones to introduce the concept of spell list to Fire Emblem, and also made significant strides in differentiating offensive magic from its physical counterparts by having spells ignore terrain, something that's been carried over into the most recent game, by the way, and by converting hit points into a sort of mana system that kinda makes me wonder if the developers of FE2 just ran out of space for data on the cartridge, like how it cost money to shoot your bow in the first Legend of Zelda because there wasn't room for an arrow counter. So, to the 5 people who actually like Gaiden and Echoes, I haven't forgotten about them, and indeed quite enjoy aspects of their quirky approach to magic. But we're largely sticking to 3 houses, because it's the Fire Emblem game most players will associate with spell lists now, and because the algorithm will stop giving me views if I don't put Edelgard on a thumbnail every now and then. Houses doesn't copy Valentia's magical mechanics entirely. Most obviously, HP is no longer used as a resource. Instead, the game operates on a Dungeons & Dragons style system where each spell has a fixed number of uses per map, with no way to increase that number other than being in certain classes that double the uses of either individual spells or types of magic. This is more similar to standard Fire Emblem durability, but at the same time, it is markedly distinct because spells have fewer uses than weapons do. But they refresh after every battle, and you never have to worry about repairing them. Like in Gaiden and Echoes, characters will gain new spells as they grow, although here it's tied to the 2 magic skill ranks rather than unit level. Also, as with the Valentian games, the list of generic spells, those learned by all characters, is actually quite low. There are 35 total spells available to the playable cast, and yet only 2 of those appear in everyone's list. The basic heal spell, and a weak iteration of the classic HP-draining Nosferatu. All the rest are distributed unevenly among your units, and you have no control over who learns what. And that's one of the major criticisms of spell lists as a mechanic, that they make certain characters objectively better mages than others. For the most extreme example, Warp is as overpowered as it is in every Fire Emblem game, but here it's learned by only 4 characters. This heavily encourages you to use one of these 4 regardless of any other qualities they might possess, and heavily discourages you from training them in any physical class where they can't use Warp. Although, you can do that. You can break out that Great Knight Lysithea meme build by leveling her through a bunch of physical classes to boost her strength, and then giving her a strong forged axe, and it'll mostly work, at least on normal mode. And it won't sting as hard because there are other Warp users, and other characters who can roughly replicate Lysithea's level of magical offense. But the flip side to this is that the reverse is very much not true. Characters with bad magic but workable spell lists, like Ferdinand or Bernadetta, can still be serviceable mages, but the ones who only get a small number of weak spells can't realistically be salvaged even on the lowest difficulty. Caspar, Raphael, and Alois, who are all stuck with this abysmal list, are never going to be decent mages, because you can't buy or forge better spells for them. The only thing you can really do is stick them in classes that double their number of spell uses per map, like Warlock or Bishop. And even then, the most flexible option for that is female exclusive, because Houses is infamous for giving male mages the short end of the stick. If I had to, for instance, name the worst female mage in the game, it would be Petra. She's got Banes in both magic types, a disappointing 25% magic growth, and spells that pack little punch, and in the case of Restore, are literally unusable most of the time. But even with all that, you can still make Petra a Grimoire to double how many offensive spells she can cast, or make her a Dark Flyer to boost her black magic damage while also granting her all the benefits of flight. There are around 10 or so male characters whom I would consider to have genuinely bad spell lists, and they have to work around those without any such comparable benefits from their exclusive classes. The most insulting might be Felix, because the game teases you into thinking he'll be a good mage by giving him a budding talent in Reason, and then you see that his entire black magic list consists of Thunder and Thoron. However, as you might have gathered, I'm not really here to drag spell list. In fact, it's my opinion that they deserve more love than they get, for the simple reason that they're among the only aspects of current Fire Emblem games that create noticeable gameplay distinctions between characters, even if those distinctions can frequently be annoying to fight against. Freeform class systems leave remarkably little room for unit variation, especially with class growths somewhat dulling the impact of each unit's personal stats. You could just say that that's where the writing and character interactions ought to take center stage, but gameplay is a definite factor as well, because Fire Emblem isn't really a dating sim masquerading as a tactical RPG like it's sometimes accused of being these days. Trust me, I play real dating sims, and no game in this franchise can really compare on that front. Spell lists not only allow magic to operate under a completely different system from physical weapons, but they go some way toward differentiating individual units more than other factors like personal skills or combat arts, which are comparable to spells in how they're obtained, but are less visually unique, and have overall less specialized distribution. Furthermore, spell lists can suggest character quirks that wouldn't be evident otherwise, and there's a lot of these if you really want to dig into it. We've already highlighted an unfortunate trio of characters who share the same terrible spell list, but Dedue and Catherine have just the same, only they also get to add Ragnarok. Guess those two have something else in common besides being incredibly gay for their lords. Edelgard and Yuritsa stand out as the only characters with both black and dark magic, although this does hurt them a bit because the system isn't really designed for that. Topping out their ranks in Reason gives Edelgard boosted range and damage only for her 2 dark spells, whereas Yuritsa only gets it for his black magic spells. Yuritsa's one dark spell, by the way, is Death, which is as morbidly on-brand as you could possibly get. Back to Edelgard, she and Claude share the trait of having elemental preferences that tie not only into their own theming, that is, the Flame Emperor and Verdant Wind, etc., but also into the genealogy of the Holy War characters that loosely inspired them. Claude shares his reason list with Yuri, which isn't surprising, as well as Annette, which kind of is. Annette has a Bane and Bows. Why does she have the Arrow spell? Sedith, Flane, and Linhardt all have a mix of wind and fire spells to prop up their familial and/or crest connection, while Sylvain and Lawrence do the same with fire and arrows, although there's not much of an obvious association between those two. Felix's underwhelming reason list is shared by Dimitri and Gilbert for some common electrical mediocrity among the high-ranking members of the Kingdom of Fargus. Hilda weirdly would be in the same boat, only she randomly learns bolting too, so that's fun. Byleth has the same reason list as Mercedes, for no apparent reason. Most characters stick to one or two elemental types, but there's a couple of exceptions, including Constance, whose eclectic blend of fire, ice, and lightning calls to mind the range of anima spells in the GBA games. Her Fimbulvetter is also the only instance of a character learning just one of the two ice spells, rather than both. Manuela and Anna, who have the shared trait of being hybrid characters that dabble in a bit of everything and so kind of suck at everything, have curiously symmetrical spell list, composed of either Warp or Rescue, a long-range damage spell, and overall sort of mirrored fire and thunder offensive options. Manuela also lacks any healing spells beyond the generic one despite being the school nurse, underscoring a point she makes about the difference between medicine and healing magic. Speaking of heals, no character learns both Recover and Physic, but 3/4 of the roster learn one or the other. Offensive light magic is spread quite thin in this game, although every member of the Ashen Wolves comes with one such spell. Lysithea, on the other hand, is the only character to learn more than 2 light damage spells, getting Seraphim and Abraxas on top of the generic Nosferatu. Hubert gets the distinction of having the only truly unique spell among the playable cast, as the only character to learn the fittingly toxic-looking Mire. A shame that Three Hopes had to screw that up by giving Mire to Shez, but that game's a spin-off, so I don't have to talk about it here. That is kind of a cop-out, since Hopes does add a few more playable characters with quirky spell lists of their own, like Shez and Monica also featuring the black and dark magic combo, but I think I've made my point here. There's not a ton of numerical variation among many of the spells in Three Houses, but these lists are great for adding extra flavor in a way that can be tough to replicate with how tomes are handled in other games. And if there's one thing that people love about Fodlan, it's that this setting has a bunch of flavor. As I mentioned at the start, game mechanics in Fire Emblem can be a toss-up, with no telling what will stick around and what won't. Engage returns to Fates' system of no durability for anything but staves, although it takes a bit more cues from Awakening with its tomes by focusing on the 3 standard elements and giving each of them their own role. It's a step up, although with only a single character getting her own unique tome, it's not hitting the same highs as the games with spell list can attain. Also, why do you hate light magic, IS? Would it have killed you to add a few regular light tomes instead of restricting it to a couple of emblem spells? Whatever. The point is, IS gives and IS takes, and while I wouldn't be surprised at all if we saw spell list coming back in a future game, there's absolutely no telling when that will be or exactly how they'll be handled. But how do you feel about spell list, or Fire Emblem's take on magic in general? Are there any other recurring mechanics in this series you think deserve some more love? Tell me about it in the comments, and be sure to like the video and subscribe to my channel for more Fire Emblem content. I tend not to talk about gameplay concepts too often, but every once in a while the mood will strike me. Thanks for watching, everyone. Au revoir.